There is a tomb in Cyprus that nobody talks about. It belongs to a man named Lazarus. You may have heard of him. Jesus called him out of his first tomb in front of his sisters 2,000 years ago in a village outside Jerusalem called Bethany. The whole crowd watched him walk out wrapped in burial cloths. What you may not know is that 60 years later, give or take, Lazarus died again and was buried again in a town in Cyprus called Larnaca. The Eastern Orthodox Church keeps his second tomb to this day. Tourists can visit it. His second tomb. And here is what nobody told me. Every single person God raised from the dead in the Bible before Jesus, every one of them has a second tomb somewhere. 7 resurrections, 7 returns, 7 bodies that walked back out into the daylight, and 7 bodies that eventually walked back into the dark. I have thought about this for a long time, and I want to tell you why it matters. Because if you came here tonight after losing someone, a father, a mother, a child, a husband, and you have been waiting for God to do something, and you have heard pastors quote these stories at funerals to tell you that God raises the dead, there is something in those stories no one told you, something that when you finally see it will not make you feel worse. It will make you feel sane. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through all 7. Most people can name 2 or 3. The 7th, almost no one teaches. And by the time we reach number 3, you will realize the pattern broke long before Jesus ever showed up. Broke in the strangest verse in the 2nd book of Kings, a verse most pastors skip because they do not know what to do with it. But it is there, and it changes everything you think you know about how God deals with death. Stay close, because every resurrection before Jesus was a rehearsal. The real performance had not yet begun, and the reason you are still waiting for someone you loved, for healing that never came, for a phone call that will never ring again, is not because God forgot you. It is because God is not in the business of temporary returns. He is building something else. Let me show you. The first resurrection in the Bible happens in the 9th century before Christ, in a place called Zarephath. You may have never heard of it. It is on the coast of what is now Lebanon, a small town wedged between Tyre and Sidon. In that town, in a long drought, a Hebrew prophet named Elijah is hiding in the home of a Phoenician widow. She has one son. She is not Jewish. She worships the gods of Sidon, not the God of Israel. And her son is the only future she has. Then her son gets sick. The text in 1 Kings chapter 17 does not give us much. It says the boy's illness grew worse and worse until there was no breath left in him. That phrase in Hebrew is the language of total absence. The breath is gone. The life is gone. And the widow does what every grieving parent does first. She gets angry. She turns to Elijah and she accuses him. She accuses him of bringing her sins to memory. She accuses him of killing her son by being in her house. She says, in her own way, what every parent at a child's funeral has said in some form. If God is so present, why is my child gone? Pay attention to what Elijah does next. He does not preach. He does not lecture her on faith. He does not give her 3 steps to healing. He takes the dead boy out of her arms, carries him upstairs to the room he has been staying in, and lays the body on his own bed. And then he prays one of the strangest prayers in the entire Old Testament. He says, Yahweh, my God, let this child's nephesh return to him. That word, nephesh, does not mean soul the way we use the word soul. In Hebrew, it means the breath, the self, the thing that makes you you. It is the word God breathed into Adam's nostrils in Genesis chapter 2. Elijah is not asking for spiritual revival. He is asking for the breath that is gone to come back into a body that has stopped moving. And then he stretches himself over the boy 3 times, body to body, hand to hand, face to face, and the breath returns. Elijah carries the boy back down the stairs. He hands him to his mother, and the widow, the Phoenician widow, who worshipped Sidonian gods until that moment, says something that changes her forever. She says, Now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. This is the first one. A grieving mother, a prophet who did not run from her grief, a breath returning, a boy alive again, and then, eventually, when this boy grew older, he died again. The text never tells us when, But it must have happened because his name appears in no genealogy of the resurrected, only in the genealogy of the dead. The second resurrection happens about 50 years later in a town called Shunammite, on the southern edge of the Jezreel Valley. The prophet has changed. Elijah is gone. His successor Elisha now travels through the region, and a wealthy, unnamed woman from Shunem builds him a small room on the roof of her house, a bed, a table, a chair, a lamp. She is married. She has no children. She has accepted her childlessness the way some women accept being widowed at 30, not as a wound, as a fact. Elisha tells her she will have a son. A year later, the son is born. The text skips ahead to the day he is old enough to walk into the field with his father. He cries out, "My head, my head." A servant carries him back to his mother. He sits on her lap until noon. And then, in the language of 2 Kings chapter 4, he died. Watch what she does. She does not call her husband. She does not weep. She does not wail. She walks upstairs, lays the dead boy on the bed where Elisha used to sleep, shuts the door behind her, and goes to find the prophet. When she finds him, she will not speak. She will not give him her grief. She grabs his feet and refuses to let go. Elisha returns with her. He goes into the room. He shuts the door. He prays. And then, and you will not hear this part in most Bible school lessons, he stretches himself over the body the way Elijah did, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. The boy's body grows warm. Elisha gets up, walks around the room, and lies on him again. The boy sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes. There is no comfortable way to say this, but the pattern you are watching is already disturbing if you slow down. 2 grieving mothers. 2 prophets who use their own bodies as bridges between life and death. 2 boys returned. And the boy who sneezed 7 times, he eventually died once more. But then comes resurrection number 3. And this one breaks every assumption you have about how God raises the dead. The story is in 2 Kings chapter 13. It is exactly 2 verses long. Most pastors will preach for 30 years and never touch it. Elisha, the great prophet who raised the Shunammite boy, has been dead for over a year. His body is buried in a tomb in the hill country. One spring, a band of Moabite raiders crosses the border. A group of Israelite mourners is in the middle of a funeral when the raiders appear. The mourners panic. They have a body to dispose of. They see Elisha's tomb, and they do the unthinkable. They throw the corpse in. Here is what nobody told me. The text says, "When the man touched the bones of Elisha, he came to life and stood up on his feet." No prayer, no prophet, no grieving mother, no witness who loved him. The man has no name. We do not know how he died. We do not know who he was. He fell into a tomb because someone needed to be rid of him, and a dead prophet's bones brought him back to life. This is the verse that broke the pattern, because every resurrection up to this point required a human witness, a human grief, a human prayer. This one required nothing. God reached through the bones of a dead man into the body of a dead stranger and gave him his breath back. As if God wanted you to know, and I think he did, that even the people no one is praying for, God can still find. And then he died again. More than 8 centuries passed between Resurrection 3 and Resurrection 4, between Elisha's bones and the next time a body comes back from the dead in the Bible. Empires rise and fall. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. The temple is destroyed, rebuilt, defiled, cleansed, and finally rebuilt again under Herod. Generations of Jewish parents bury Jewish children, and no breath returns. No prophet shows up. No one is raised. And then, in the 1st century A.D., in a small fishing town called Capernaum on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, a synagogue ruler named Jairus pushes through a crowd to fall at the feet of an unknown rabbi from Nazareth. His daughter is 12. She is dying. And by the time he gets the rabbi to follow him home, a messenger meets them in the street with the words every father in human history has feared. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. Your daughter is dead. But the rabbi keeps walking. He pushes past the professional mourners. He takes Peter, James, and John into the bedroom. He takes the girl's hand. And he says 2 words in Aramaic, the everyday language she would have heard from her own mother since she was a baby. Talitha cum, little girl, get up. She gets up, the fourth resurrection. And the little girl who heard Talitha cum from the lips of God. She eventually died again. Somewhere in the soil around Capernaum, her bones are still in the ground. A short time later, walking through a town in the south called Nain, the same rabbi meets a funeral procession at the city gate. A woman is following the coffin of her only son. She is a widow. She has no husband. With this son in the coffin, she has no future, no inheritance, no protection. She did not ask Jesus for anything. She did not even know who he was, which means this is the only resurrection in the Gospels that began entirely with him, not with her faith, not with her prayer, not with her asking, just with his eyes landing on a woman he had never met. The same way God reached for the unnamed man in Elisha's tomb. As if to say it again, 8 centuries later, he still sees the ones who never asked. The text in Luke chapter 7 says only that when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. He touches the coffin. He says, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the boy sits up and begins to speak. Jesus takes him and gives him back to his mother. The exact phrase Elijah used 9 centuries earlier when he gave the boy back to the widow of Zarephath. The crowd recognizes the repetition. They say, "A great prophet has risen among us." The 5th resurrection. And the young man Jesus handed back to his mother. He eventually walked back into the dark. The widow buried him a second time. The Gospels do not tell us how she carried it. You can feel what is happening, can you not? The intensity is building. Each story is bigger. Each crowd is wider. Each grief is more public. And then comes Lazarus. The story is in John chapter 11. Lazarus is a friend of Jesus, the brother of Mary and Martha, living in a village called Bethany 2 miles outside Jerusalem. He gets sick. The sisters send for Jesus. Jesus delays. By the time he arrives, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. In Jewish tradition of the time, the soul was believed to linger near the body for 3 days. After 4 days, there was no hope. The body had begun to decay. Jesus weeps. I want you to hold on to that for a moment. The Son of God standing at the tomb of his friend, who he could raise with a word, who he knew he was about to raise, weeps. Not theatrically, not symbolically. The Greek word is edikryson. He shed actual tears. Then he stands at the mouth of the cave. He calls out, "Lazarus duro exo," Lazarus, come out. And a man wrapped in burial cloths walks out of the tomb. The 6th resurrection. But here is what nobody preaches about Lazarus. In John chapter 12, the very next chapter, the chief priests plot to kill Lazarus along with Jesus because so many people were believing because of him. Lazarus had to flee. Tradition holds, and this is tradition, not scripture, that he settled in Cyprus, where he became the first bishop of a town called Kidion. I told you about a tomb in Cyprus at the start of this video. This is the moment that tomb starts mattering, because the man who walked out of his first tomb in front of his sisters 2,000 years ago eventually walked into a second one in Larnaca, and he did not walk back out. And then he died again. 6 resurrections, 6 returns, 6 bodies that walked back out into the daylight and eventually walked back into the dark. I want you to stop here just for a moment. If you have been carrying a question through this entire video, if God can raise the dead, why did he not raise the one I love? I want you to know I have not forgotten you. I am not avoiding your question. We are walking toward it. But first, the 7th resurrection. And this one is the strangest of all. Open the Gospel of Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 through 53. The passage describes the moment Jesus dies on the cross. The temple veil is torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shakes. Rocks split open. And then comes one of the most peculiar sentences in the entire New Testament. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. You read that, and your mind stutters. Tombs broke open at Jesus' death. Bodies came out. They walked into Jerusalem. They appeared to people. And the text gives no names, no count, no follow-up. They appeared, and the gospel writer moves on like he just remembered to grab milk on the way home. Most pastors do not know what to do with this passage. Some treat it as figurative. Some treat it as apocalyptic vision, but Matthew records it like a news report, sandwiched between two of the most consequential moments in human history. And here is the strangest detail. They came out of their tombs after his resurrection. They were raised when Jesus died, but they did not leave their tombs until after Jesus had left his, like they were waiting for someone to go first. The seventh resurrection. Saints, plural and unnamed, witnessed by some unspecified number of people in Jerusalem during the most chaotic weekend of the first century, and no one writes them a chronicle. No one records their second deaths. I want you to notice something about that. Resurrection number 3, the man who fell into Elisha's tomb, also nameless. We never learned who he was. We never learned who his family was. We never learned why he died. And now, resurrection number 7, these saints walking through Jerusalem, also nameless, equally uncounted. The first unnamed resurrection in the Bible and the last one before Jesus walks out of his own tomb, both anonymous. As if God were telling you from the beginning and the end of this story that he sees the ones no one writes down. The widow at Zarephath has a son the text remembers. The Shunammite has a son the text remembers. Jairus has a daughter the text remembers. Lazarus the text remembers. But somewhere in the middle and somewhere at the end are the resurrections whose names are written nowhere except in the records of heaven. Hold that thought, because in a moment you will see why it matters more than you think. They appeared, they witnessed, and the gospel falls silent on them. Which means, somewhere in some unmarked Jerusalem cemetery, there are graves of the resurrected. And eventually, every one of those graves was used a second time, because eventually, they died again. Now look at the pattern. All 7 of them, every man, woman, and child raised from the dead in the Bible before Jesus walked out of his own tomb, every one of them returned to the dust. Their resurrections were beautiful, their resurrections were merciful, their resurrections were real, and their resurrections were temporary. Here is what nobody told me. The reason you have been waiting for someone you love to come back, the reason that wait has not been answered the way it was for the widow of Zarephath, the reason your prayer for healing did not arrive the way Jairus's did. It is not because you have less faith than they had. It is not because God loves you less than he loved them. It is because God is not running rehearsals anymore. The performance has begun. Stay with me on this, because every resurrection before Jesus has a feature in common. The body that walked out, walked back in. Every resurrection before Jesus required someone to do it for them. Elijah, Elisha, Elisha's bones, Jesus himself. Every one of those resurrected people died a second death, and that second death was the real death. Until one morning, in a garden outside Jerusalem, in a tomb sealed with a Roman stone, a body that had been dead for 3 days got up, walked out, left the burial cloths folded behind him, met a woman in the garden, ate breakfast on a beach with his friends, walked through walls, showed his scars, and then, and you have to hold this in your mind carefully, he did not go back. He did not die again. The Apostle Paul, writing about 30 years later to a Greek church confused about resurrection, picks one specific word, aparche, first fruits, the first wheat of the harvest, the sample that proves the rest of the crop is coming. He says, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, the first fruits, not the only fruit. The first one, 2,000 years later, in November of 1963, a 64-year-old British writer named C.S. Lewis lay dying in his home in Oxford. His wife, Joy, had died 3 years earlier of bone cancer. He had spent the first year after her death writing one of the most honest books about grief ever published, under a pseudonym, so no one would know it was him. In that book, he wrote about waking up at 4 a.m, alone in a quiet house, wondering if God was real or just a story he had told himself to make the dark less dark. He wrote that grief felt nothing like sadness. It felt like fear. He buried his wife in 1960. He waited 3 years. He did not stop loving her. He did not stop missing her. He did not get healed of his grief the way you get healed of the flu. But somewhere in those 3 years, he made his peace with a strange truth, that the Christian hope was not that joy would come back to him in this life like Lazarus came back to his sisters. The Christian hope was that he would go to her in a body that would not die again, in a world that had finally exited its long rehearsal. He died on November 22, 1963, the same day John F. Kennedy was shot. His death made the back pages of the newspaper because the front page had Dallas on it. He went quietly to the woman he had been waiting for. So here is what I want you to take from these 7 resurrections. Every one of them happened. The widow of Zarephath got her son back. The Shunammite got her son back. A dead stranger came back through bones. A 12-year-old girl sat up at Talitha Cum. A widow's son sat up at the gates of Nain. Lazarus walked out of his cave. Saints walked out of unnamed tombs into Jerusalem. The God of the Bible has been raising the dead for 3,000 years. That part is not a metaphor. It is the most established pattern in the entire Old Testament. But none of those resurrections were permanent. All of them were rehearsals. And the waiting you are doing for someone you love is not the kind of waiting that the widow of Zarephath did. It is the kind of waiting that C.S. Lewis did. You are not waiting for a temporary return. You are waiting for a permanent reunion. This is not a story about people who came back from the dead. It is not a story about miracles. It is not a story about prophets with special powers. This is a story about a God who has been practicing resurrection on people no one was watching for 3,000 years, not because he needed to learn how, but because you needed to see what he was always going to do permanently, so that when he finally raises the one you have been praying for, there will be no second tomb behind them, and no third one, and no last one ever again. If you came to this video tonight wondering if your prayers for healing went unheard, or wondering if God noticed when you sat at a hospital bedside and asked him for one more day, please listen to me. The reason your prayer was not answered the way Jairus' prayer was answered is not because Jairus loved his daughter more. It is because Jairus' daughter was a rehearsal. And rehearsals are over. The performance has begun. And the curtain that lifts at the end of it lifts on something none of these 7 resurrected people got to see. A return that does not have a second tomb behind it. Tell me in the comments, who are you waiting for? Just a first name. I will not respond to all of them, but I will read them. And this morning, before the day begins, I want you to remember this. The widow of Zarephath got her son back for a few decades. You are not waiting for that. You're waiting for something better. You're waiting for the first fruits to finish the harvest.